Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of George Mason University and Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, find other episodes, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Today is February 7th, 2012, and my guest is David Weinberger, a senior researcher at the Berkman Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University. His latest book is Too Big to Know. David, welcome back to EconTalk.
Hi.
Our subject for today is knowledge, which is what your book is about. How has knowledge and our understanding of knowledge changed because of the Internet, and how has it changed over time? You start early on in the book, you give a brief history of empirical knowledge and expertise, and you use Malthus as an example of someone whose work had to change. Can you talk about that to start us off?
Yes. So the question is what role facts play, because in the modern world these days, we continue to have a hope that facts will settle arguments. This is put really well by Senator Moynihan, the late Senator Moynihan, when he said, everybody's entitled to his own opinion, but not his own facts, which is a sort of lovely way of putting an old idea, at least an Enlightenment idea, and I think you can trace it back way further than that, where the idea is that we seem to have lots of disagreements, there's lots of opinions in the world, lots of ideas, and we argue about them. But, says Moynihan, and the role of facts themselves, if we just sit down and look at the way the world is, look at the facts, reasonable people can come together, and knowledge will heal us, will help us pass these divides. And knowledge that, in particular, in this case, looks at facts, as if facts are the irrefutable foundation of knowledge. And so, much as I like facts, and I believe in facts, and I think some things are true and some things are false, nevertheless, facts are a very modern invention. They're very new as a concept, and their role in knowledge is only a couple of 100 years old. And so in the book, I use Malthus as a convenient example of what a pre-fact form of knowledge looked like. That is, when we didn't try to build knowledge up based upon the recitation and citation of facts. And so in his famous work that showed that the world was likely to starve itself to death because the population increases faster than the food supply.
Or so he thought.
Yes. And, at the time,
wasn't unreasonable.
Perhaps, yeah. But we've managed to break that curve pretty well. So he writes a book about it, and it's an important book. It's classic work, but it's really sort of fact-free. He's not arguing by looking around the world and looking at statistics about food consumption and food production and population growth. He instead is doing the best he can at the time, 1800 or so, gathering information about various ethnic groups, or sorry, not really ethnic groups, but cultural groups around the world, and how they manage the problem of food supply. They're really not very fact-based. But then over the next, 20, 25 years, he revises it 6 times, 6 editions. It gets substantially larger, and it gets filled with modern facts. The fact, it looks much more like a modern work. And so over that period of time, this is why I use him as an example, you can see the rise of facts as a way of grounding knowledge and of arguing for positions. It's pretty dramatic. It happened very, very quickly.
And what, in his case, do you think something jar him? Did he get pushed, or did he just have this new opportunity?
It was in the air. It was in the air for a couple of reasons. One is statistics started to grow as a way of looking at the world, and that was the term statistics entered the English language, I think, around 1780. Came from the German, and so statistics as a discipline is growing. And Jeremy Bentham's work begins to have a major effect on British thinking. In particular, the British class system was pretty crummy for those who were not in the upper classes, and it was assumed that the poor were poor because they deserved to be. It was basically a moral argument or a set of moral assumptions that the poor they drank, they were lazy, they had no discipline, they were dishonest, and so that's why they're poor. And the rich, of course, were rich because they embodied the virtues. And it was a pretty nasty sort of social stew, especially when it results in 8-year-olds being shoved into 7-by-7-inch chimney flues to clean them, and it's really for their own good. And you'd get this sort of argument. You can read it in Parliament as some of the reform bills were being introduced. That it keeps them off the streets because they'd be pickpockets and they grow up to be drunks like their fathers anyway. It's really good for them. It's really not bad for them anyway. It's a good, healthy work ethic, and it's just good, healthy work for those 10-year-olds. So Bentham comes along. A polymath philosopher guy, and suggests that there might actually be another way of thinking about how to structure, how to make value decisions in a society, which is you assume everybody has an equal interest in happiness or pleasure or whatever you want to call it. And so you just sort of measure what policies will bring more happiness into the world and less, and you drop out of it who is it bringing happiness to. So all happiness is equal. And so now you can do a type of statistical measure, at least you can start looking at that to see what the effect of policies might be, and maybe even more important, you have a reason to look at what the current happiness rate is of your population, regardless of class. So you drop the moral thing out of it, and you just look. And so now you have an incentive to go out and look across your society and to wonder, are poor chimney sweep boys actually being harmed medically by this? I mean, we'd like to believe not, but let's take a look. And so the culture begins actually a factual investigation of itself.
And they find that it's actually maybe not so good for them.
Yes, and it's during the first half of the 19th century in England, you start to get these reform movements that are based on facts. So the Parliament starts to compile blue books, so-called for an obvious reason, which are modern-day reports based on statistics and actual facts in order to argue policies. And by the mid-19th century, this regime of fact is so dominant that Dickens actually starts pushing back against it. Facts, facts, facts. He has Professor Gradgrind, one of these awful, you already know these.
Yeah, he's the bad guy. Yeah, Dickens didn't pull any, he wasn't so subtle.
No, he was sort of Stephen King of his era. But you already have Dickens, pushing back against policy determined only by fact, as opposed to understanding the human plight. This is a very modern sort of complaint, by the way.
Sure, postmodern.
Yeah, I mean, we've had echoes of this throughout our culture, all in the 20th century and beyond, where the fact-based expert is viewed as cold-hearted and merely a numbers cruncher and
green eye shade.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, the avatar of this in American culture is the Rand Corporation. Oh, now I'm having a senior moment of forgetting the guy's name. The nuclear theorist. Oh,
Herman Kahn.
Thank you so much.
I read your book.
You read the book more recently than I did.
Yeah, I know all about that. Sure, go ahead.
So in the modern age, this is too old for many of your listeners, I'm sure, but Herman Kahn in the 1950s, the Rand Corporation, which still is a very important expert consulting company to the government. Kahn was writing books about nuclear theory, games theory, in which he would make calculations about, well, if we responded, here are the various responses possible to a Russian first launch. If we did this, that would happen. If we did this other thing, only 20 million people would be killed. And, it is a sort of rational calculation that he was making. It's better for 20 million people to be killed than 100 million. Nevertheless, for, I think, pretty obvious reasons, he got taken as the very symbol of the cold-blooded, fact-based, statistically based expert. That is reflected. I mean, he's basically a character. In real life, I don't know, but he culturally became a character right out of Dickens, and it was the same sort of pushback against knowledge based merely on facts.
Yeah, his most famous book at the time, and you're right, it's lost to many of our younger listeners, was Thinking the Unthinkable, which was a great title. But that would be Thinking the Unthinkable, right? What's the best way to minimize the losses from a nuclear attack? And you could argue that's a good thing to think about. You could argue it's not a good thing to think about.
And both arguments were made. I mean, the argument against was, as I remember, was that by making it thinkable, you were making it more plausible.
More likely, yeah. Now, I just want to mention that we do have the first and sixth editions of Malthus's work on population up on the Library of Economics and Liberty website. We'll put links up to them if you want to wade through them and confirm or challenge David Weinberger's assertion that the later editions became more empirical, but I suspect you're right. But you can read it for yourself and watch that happen, which is very cool. So what's interesting about this to me as a modern is that there's this unavoidable tension between fact-free discourse is obviously dangerous, but there's this other danger that it's not so much you leave out the human side, it's that facts are not really truth. You often need a context or a theory to generate them, to understand them, to not be misled by them. And we have this worship of facts, which you do talk about in the book, this transition between, certainly between the ancients and the moderns, that moderns are more empirical and experts have the facts on their side, which is a little bit it's misleading in its own right. It's not always reliably true. Facts do not always get us closer to the truth, and certainly not all statistical analysis gets us closer to the truth.
No, but I want to sort of tread a very careful line, because we have seen what happens when we have administrations that don't care about facts. Some things can go terribly, terribly wrong. Facts are really important. So on the one hand, I do not want to be lumped with people who say that all facts are constructions and that you can believe whatever you want to believe. And I don't believe that. On the other hand, I do think that it's important, as you say, to recognize that facts are, to some degree, they are constructions. It's not. It isn't. The world is one way, and it's not other ways. But facts. Let me give you an example, and this is also from the book. So there's a site called Hunch.com, which is about helping. It's a recommendation site. It recommends things that are matters of taste. What movie should I see tonight? What type of food am I in the mood for? And it will give you an answer. Not a lot hanging on the answer. I want to buy a wedding gift for a cousin, and can you make any suggestions? So the way that Hunch works is that it asks you a series of questions, basically an endless series of questions, and many of them are generated by users at this point. And the questions are themselves sort of game-like and intensely, often silly, irrelevant, and impossible. And so some of them are, could be a straightforward thing, like do you prefer pink or red? But many of them are things like have you ever petted a dolphin? Do you store your kitchen glasses right side up or upside down? When you get a cell phone, do you also buy a cover for it? Do you own any plaid clothing? And from this, they induce what your preferences are for what movie you want to see or what food you want to eat. And in my case, it works pretty well. It works pretty well. one of the interesting things is that they very explicitly do not, at Hunch, try to generate a theory of human taste. They don't know why, if you've ever touched a dolphin, helps as an indicator of whether you will want to go see a particular movie tonight. They purposefully are theory free. They're just doing analysis,
just following the number, just looking at the correlations.
Yes, which I think is interesting because it's a type of knowledge without understanding, insofar as it works. But the reason I bring it up is as you go through these. Would you rather take a Subway or eat a brownie? These are not polar opposites. It's a very silly question,
right?
But they don't care,
right?
But it nevertheless is a fact. So here's a fact that I've learned from Hunch. I've never touched I've never petted a dolphin. That's a fact.
Yep.
It may well be that the next question that they're going to ask me is, have you ever petted an orangutan? And that's a fact too. Have you ever touched an orangutan's ear? No, I have not. Another fact. Have you ever petted a plaid dolphin? No, I have not, now that you ask. That is also a fact. These are insanely trivial facts, but they are facts. So the reason that I bring this up is that I think it helps make clear the extent to which facts are constructed. So the content of the fact can be right or wrong, but that you have picked this particular set of things as the facts that are worth looking at is entirely a construction. It depends upon what your interests are. And so to think that so facts remain very important, but to think naively, as I think in our history we have, that we can get to knowledge by accumulating facts is not at all the case. Because I have never touched a plaid dolphin, that's also a fact. There is art as well as science in deciding which of the facts are the foundation upon which you're going to build belief. And that means that foundation is itself not a natural object, as we have thought. It is itself a construction.
Yeah, well, I want to take your example and let me take you to a different place and see if you still agree. I certainly agree with you that there's this very narrow, nuanced path that I often feel myself taking in this jungle of whether facts are truth or not and constructed or not. And if you're not careful, you end up you believe in, say, voodoo or ESP or something that's horrifyingly you think is wrong. But if you're not, you can go the other way and you can be deluded into thinking you have the truth when you're not even close. So I'll give you an example. Your examples, barring a mistyping on the survey on the computer or a whimsical decision to lie about my dolphin petting experience, right? Those facts you're talking about, they're either true or false. I've either petted a dolphin or I haven't, and I might lie about it on the survey or make a mistake, but in general, those are facts. How tall I am at any point in time in my life. These are measurable things. There's a measurement error potentially. You might want to say plus or minus a millimeter or two because maybe I'm slumping a bit or I had a bad night's sleep. But we all understand those kind of uncertainties about facts. But those aren't the facts we use for public policy decisions or social science or even physical science. The things that we use for those are facts in a really, I would argue, very, very different kind of way. And let me give you an example and see what your reaction is. In the 1980s, the U.S. homeownership rate fell. It fell fairly dramatically by historical standards. And one of the reactions of policymakers was concern that housing had become unaffordable, that the housing market wasn't working well. And that was either an excuse, justification, or cause for a lot of public policy encouraging homeownership in the United States. Now, was it a fact that the homeownership rate was declining? It was probably a fact. Why it was happening is not a fact. That's a theory, a model, a metaphor, a vision, a hypothesis. And in fact, the standard interpretations of that, one of the things that I've never seen discussed, for example, is that the divorce rate was rising dramatically in the United States in the late 70s, throughout the 70s actually. And so when you went to measure the home ownership rate, you had a lot more entries in the denominator because there were more households all of a sudden. And a lot of those people had split up, of which one became a renter and who had been a homeowner before. And so that told us nothing about how easy or difficult it was to afford a house. It was a result of a social phenomenon called a higher divorce rate. And so those kind of facts, which come up with income inequality, growth of income, crucial issues which are going to affect politics, legislation, et cetera, they're not in the same realm of have you petted a dolphin. They're complicated and often not truth. They're something, they have truthiness, but they're not truth.
Well, that homeownership fell isn't truthy, it's true.
Oh, that's right. No, right. I agree with that. But what,
I'm just trying to make sure I'm getting the gist of this, because I think that we agree, but let's see. So the fact that homeownership fell, we will take as true, and we'll stipulate that it's true, and thus is a fact, and is likely an important fact. How we put them together, we've known forever. That's all that we talk about, even in the age of facts, is what the relationship among the facts are. And are we considering the right facts? This is one of the reasons why Freakonomics is an eternal bestseller. Is that holy cow, there's a set of facts we have, there's conditions we haven't considered.
Well, I think there are very few facts in that book, actually. There's a lot of statistical analysis, which I don't consider factual.
Interesting. Okay, but then I withdraw the.
Well, let's talk about that. I mention it because you're not a really regular listener. I talk about it maybe way too much on this program, but I'm very interested in the problem of how we understand causal relationships in social science and in economics. And I would say it's equally problematic in the other social sciences, if not worse. We use various multivariate statistical techniques to tease out causation. To take one that's in the news, did the stimulus create jobs? I'd say we have no idea. I don't think that's a scientific question. It gets answered using scientific techniques. Facts are accumulated about past government spending and past levels of employment, past levels of output. Statistical relationships are teased out among those variables. Quote, we do the best we can. Have we established a fact about, say, the relationship between $1 of government spending financed by debt and the impact on national income? And I'd say no, it's not a fact, not even close to a fact. It gets quoted as a fact. Relationship is 1.57 or 0.6, but I don't consider that a fact. And I'd say that's an enormous percentage of what goes for knowledge in the social sciences, and I think it's fake knowledge.
Well, so I refuse to disagree with you.
That's fine.
Okay. I will, at least on this point. I think that's I very much like your way of putting this. I would point maybe to two things and put it a little differently. But I suspect you'll agree, but you'll tell me. The first is that I don't think that it's an accident that we are seeing the rise of complexity theory in an age when we have the tools by which we can gather enough information that we can see how complex it is and have tools that can help us a bit to understand that complexity. The computing power doesn't keep up with the complexity, or else it wouldn't really be complexity. Nevertheless, we can do better than we could when we were just writing things down. And so we have a long cultural history of making exactly the sort of assumptions that you've just been talking about, namely, there's a set of facts, you figure out, and there's causality, and if you put the two together, you can answer a question like, did the stimulus create jobs? Or a question like, what was the cause of the Civil War? What were the causes of World War I? As if this is a finite question that must have an answer. And maybe we're not going to be good at answering it, but it's got to have an answer. But if we are in a world that is more complex than than we can imagine. And the more that we learn and the further down in the level of detail that we go, the more the complexity, the more complex it becomes. It doesn't become simpler. It used to be the case that if you went to the simpler elements, you would find something simpler. But in a fractally complex world, that's not the case. So systems biology that's looking at simple cells, the most basic element of life, it should be simple, or at least simpler than life itself, turns out to be so complex that brains can't understand it. Computers do understand at least a bunch of the interactions that happen across the cell wall, but it is a deeply, deeply complex area of life, and that's at the simplest level. So,
right. My brain or your brain is unbelievably complicated, and we're not close to understanding it very well. And then we're going to now talk about how my brain interacts with your brain.
Yeah, we don't even, as far as I'm concerned, we don't even have a good metaphor for the brain at this point, and I don't know that we ever will. Anyway, so we have, on the one hand, I think a very healthy embrace of complexity theory where somebody can interrupt the conversation and say, but I'm not even sure if that question is a scientific question. And the second thing that's happening at the same time, and not accidentally at the same time, is the growth of data commons as a way of proceeding. These enormous clouds of data that are being released from multiple disciplines. A few weeks ago, there was a report saying that we are likely to have an exabyte of genomic data within the next 2 years. I mean, that is a lot.
I assume
of data.
That's a lot.
That is a lot.
I don't know what an
data.
exabyte is. Is it after tera?
No, it's after peta.
Okay.
So it's like,
Giga,
tera,
peta, exa.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's probably wrong, but that's what I remember.
Okay.
In any case, it is gigantic bunch of data of the sort that we never even talked about. It was beyond reckoning. So we have these enormous clouds of linked data that's in formats suitable for computers to trawl through them, and there's this guy, John Wilbanks, who until recently was the head of Science Commons, that was part of Creative Commons. So he's very interested in and helping to facilitate the growth of these data commons in multiple sciences, and particularly in ways that allow them to intersect their data, hook up their data. And he says this. I think he puts this wonderfully. He's pushing back against the idea that we can take all of this data, model all of the rules, input the data, and get predictions and outcomes and understanding on the other side, which makes sense in the old view of facts and knowledge. Here are the facts. We know how they go together and turn the crank, even for complex systems. And he says, no, that will never happen. What we really need, and here's the quote, what we really need is my nerds arguing with your nerds. In a perpetual argument, right? The idea is not that, and then my nerds win and crush your nerds. It's that in that argument, the multiple nerd argument, which is looking at facts and taking facts and data very seriously. We don't want to lose sight of that. Facts still matter a lot. But the knowledge consists in not the resolution of these issues, because in a complex world, the things don't resolve that nicely, but is rather in the continued engagement, discussion, argument, disagreement among the nerds who are looking at the data and looking at the facts. And I love the quote, and I think it captures exactly what the idea is.
Yeah, there's real insight there. I keep thinking about something I saw of Nassim Taleb's. I can't remember if we talked about it in the recent interview I did with him. I think it came up, but he has a diagram where he has a giant cube, and that giant cube is what we'd like to know, and pulled out of that giant cube is a little tiny cube, and that's what we know scientifically through the scientific method, through confirmable hypotheses and tests and rejection, and we're constantly fighting the urge, usually failing, to take what we know in that little tiny cube and apply it to the big cube. And I think about that quote you just gave. Again, putting it in an economics context. Does Keynesian stimulus work? I did a rap video called "The Fight of the Century," where we talked about how this debate between, say, Keynes and Hayek or the pro-stimulus and anti-stimulus people is unsettled. It's still going on. Somehow we haven't figured it out yet. And thinking about your quote, my nerds versus your nerds, I've come to believe it's probably not resolvable through the traditional methods of science, but you do learn something from arguing about it, even if you don't convince each other in the way that you normally would through a replicable experiment. I think both sides learn something. Now, what they might learn is to get more entrenched in their own views. And let's turn to back to now some of the arguments in the book. One of the things you talk about, I think very provocatively and insightfully, is this sort of tension on the internet between hanging out with people who think just like you, which is comforting and feels good often, but dangerous because it's prone to groupthink or echo chamber effects, versus exposing yourself to other viewpoints and learning about things you don't agree with and maybe getting smarter, but less comfortable. So talk about how that's going on in the internet.
Okay, so this is actually one of my least favorite topics because I'm so uncertain.
Well, we make it short then. You don't have to talk long about it.
I
have plenty of other questions.
I think it's a really important topic to bring up in any discussion of knowledge in the internet, because the echo chamber argument is pretty well. It's a powerful argument. It says that if you give people many different sources to listen to, they will naturally tend to listen to ones that are that they agree with. And there are bad consequences of that, namely you get further confirmed in your own belief, and in fact you become more extreme in your beliefs. There's some evidence that that's what happens. And the internet is just that situation. Therefore, and so there's a great deal of agitation about the echo chamber. And on the one hand, part of me doesn't care about how severe the echo chamber effect is, whether it's a lot or a little, because even if it's a little, we still need to be doing everything we can to avoid closing ourselves off to alternative views. I'm a good liberal, not just politically, but in terms of sort of traditional liberal, Enlightenment liberal sort of guy. So I think that openness to contrary ideas improves thought. Sorry, that's what I think, and I'm old, and that thought itself is not very open to
Yeah, you're pretty close-minded about your openness, aren't you?
I am, absolutely.
Yeah.
So on the one hand, it doesn't matter how severe it is. We still need to be doing everything we can as parents and as individuals and institutionally to avoid it. On the other hand, it seems to me there's some wrong, conclusions, or maybe they're assumptions within that model that we also need to be careful about. So the models, the echo chamber model seems to assume that the only good conversation is one with somebody with whom you disagree. And otherwise, you're just in your comfort zone. I mean, the language around it is all negative. You're in your comfort zone. You're reconfirming. You're closing yourself down. So a real conversation is you arguing with somebody with whom you disagree, and not just arguing, but being open to change. Because, if you're not open to change, then you're incapable of learning, and there's no point. And so the model should be, the Jew, and I say this as a Jew, is why I take this example, but the Jew talking with a neo-Nazi, and the Jew says, "Welcome, my friend, let's have some coffee," because we're in a coffee shop, because that's that's become the setting for these conversations, these ideal conversations.
Or a salon, or it's the salon / coffee shop / faculty lounge. It's where we romanticize intellectual discourse.
Yeah, in the Habermas thing, it's the coffee shop. So I'm going to put it in a coffee shop if you don't mind. So what would you like? Would you like? It's on me. You would like? Fine. We'll get you your Nazi latte, and let's talk and let's work down to our differences. And I am open to becoming a Nazi, my good friend, just as I'm sure you are open to becoming a Jew. And that's a real conversation. But that conversation not only never happens, it can't happen, because conversation needs a great deal of agreement. And so I worry that the echo chamber argument leads us to undervalue the extent to which we need similarity in order to be able to have a simple conversation or to have a culture at all. So for you and me to talk, we have to share a language. We have to have a topic that we both think is interesting. We have to have a basic set of assumptions and values, or else we can't get anywhere. We have to have a set of conversational norms that are very particular and precise, even if we don't generally articulate them, that guide the conversation. We have to have so much in common simply to have a conversation. And furthermore, the conversations that advance thought generally are not between the Jew and the Nazi or between the creationist and the evolutionist or whatever you want to pick. They're conversations among people who know a great deal about a topic, share huge amounts. I mean, they're 99.999% in agreement, but there are two economists who disagree about this particular issue, and the conversation that advances both of their thinking is the one that iterates on some tiny difference, something that they're getting all heated in their discussion, but to an outsider who doesn't know economics, it would look like they're arguing. You would ridicule them because they're arguing over something trivial. We need echo chambers are an issue, but we should not undervalue the extent to which knowledge is based out of conversations with people with whom we fundamentally agree.
Yeah, no, it's a very deep insight, and think about it. And the reason I think it's hard to think about is that word echo chamber or groupthink, those are so horrifyingly negative as a way to describe it. But when you describe it as the way you describe it, you have to have these shared values, norms, et cetera. It makes sense. And when you look at your own life, it's when I came here to George Mason, I'm a pretty hardcore free market libertarian, classical liberal guy. I was worried we'd sit around all day when I got here and we'd talk about how bad the minimum wage is. That's not what we talk about. It's not very interesting, and it's not why fortunately, it's not what we do. And I've learned an enormous amount of economics from my colleagues here, even though we pretty much agree on most things, as you say. But just to start with, because of that agreement, you can go very deeply into aspects of things you don't fully understand in a way you can't with somebody who doesn't share norms, basic values, et cetera. So if you look at your own life and you ask yourself, who have you learned the most from, it is romantic. We do say often, oh, I've got this great friend. We don't agree on anything, but we respect each other. And often you argue with those people, but and if you're lucky, they're polite and civilized. But I think the people you'll learn the most from are maybe the people you already pretty much agree with. That may be more an indictment of our, dogmatic selves, but I think it's a deep aspect of human nature.
Yeah, and I don't think it's a dogmatic aspect. It's how culture advances. It's how knowledge advances. So if you are trying to come up with, you're in a lab and you're working on a vaccine for whatever, and you're having your weekly meeting to talk and to advance, you're having people in, it's not helpful to have somebody there who says, all vaccines cause autism. You don't want that discussion. May be important to have somewhere.
Yeah, but not there.
Right.
You need the group thing.
In the way.
You need the echo chamber working. You do.
Well, you do.
Yeah. Which is, as you say, there might be a time and place to worry about issues that are not shared or where there's diversity. But it's a really, really interesting thing. It challenges the notion, by the way, that diversity is inherently good. You talk about this a little bit in the book, this view that the way we get wiser is by encouraging all views. And there's some truth to that. Obviously, groupthink is dangerous, and you need the crank. Sometimes the crank is right. Sometimes the heretic is right. Sometimes the apostate is onto something. But a lot of times that person's a crank, and you're better off moving forward.
Yes, and what you say is important. You need both, and
you get plenty of both on the internet.
Well, but you don't have to. Well,
That's
so
true.
This is the argument. I mean, do we indeed? It's there, but are we consulting it? And I think data are very uncertain about this because it's a very difficult question to pose correctly. Cass Sunstein, from whom much of this argument comes.
Yeah, he's been a guest on here.
Oh, good. Okay, so he looks at the number of links on political sites to opposing sites, and he finds only, I think, so I always get facts and stats wrong. But I think he finds
ironically,
yeah. Well, that only 15% of political sites have links to the opposition, or it might be 15% of the links on political sites link to the opposition. And Yochai Benkler, who is this brilliant thinker and writer, as I'm sure your listeners know,
sure.
Has responded in part. He has a deep response to this, but part of it is he hears Sunstein cite this number, and he doesn't know whether he should be happy or sad. Is 15% a lot? So you can think of that as actually being, wow, political sites at 15%? Linking to the opposition, that's amazing. Or you can say, well, it really should be 50%, which is would be an absurd thing. You're on a site, Daily Kos or Red State. It's all about having a conversation among people who have a basic agreement in their politics, and you think that it's a failure of democracy if half their links don't go to the opposition. We don't have a metric for what's a reasonable amount of openness, and so the data are very hard to gather and evaluate.
Yeah, I just think that all those concerns are just way overrated. Benkler's also been a guest, by the way. We talked about something else, but I think this whole issue of whether and you talk about in the book at length, of whether the net is making us stupider or smarter is there's nothing new under the sun, and you refer to this as well. People have always complained about open access being dangerous for 100 different reasons, but so now we have a few new ones, but we have the old ones too. People can't handle it; they're not smart enough. They'll just hang out with people they agree with already. And my reaction is really just so what? I don't get what the outcome would be that you'd want if you accepted these arguments. I don't understand it. I think there is no doubt that there are negative things about the internet for my life. There's also no doubt most of them are glorious in terms of knowledge and understanding and options and choices. And I read mostly people I agree with, but I read lots of people I don't agree with. Some of them are commenting on my blog, and some of those are just sport, and they're not teaching me anything. And some of them are deep and make me think. And I think we learn through conversation, which is why I like this podcast. I learn a lot from my guests. And I think what the internet lets us do is have more conversations with more kinds of people. And some conversations are just for fun, and some of them are in that lab where you're trying to advance truth and science. And they're all kinds. They're all there, and there's more than you could ever possibly want or enjoy. They're all there to sample and taste. I think it's phenomenal.
Well, I do too, but I'm going to push back. Because I fundamentally believe that the internet, I'm very optimistic about the internet, but I don't want to overly blithely dismiss some of the issues. So,
what worries you?
One of the primary things, two things. One is really elitist. One is that people who are educated and good at gathering knowledge, which are the sorts of people that you and I generally hang out with, we're good at the internet, or so we believe. It's not as clear that people with less education, less training, are going to resist the worst aspects of the echo chamber. I think it's highly likely that those of us. So when people say the internet's making us stupider, it's very rare that they include themselves in that description. It's always those other people that it's making stupider. And I just did that, and I wanted to both acknowledge that.
There's a paternalistic aspect to it.
Yeah, yes. And wondered, and acknowledge that it's very likely that the internet is, in the same way, making highly educated people stupid as well. Nevertheless, so I look at, I'm interested in politics. And it seems just hard to deny that we have gotten more polarized as culture in the U.S. Politically. The degree of polarization over the past 4 years, and you can take it back further.
12, yeah, sure.
It does not seem to be better. It seems to be getting worse. I don't have evidence for this except, what I look at every day.
Feels that way, though. It does.
And first of all, I think that's a bad thing. And second of all, it is coincident, not entirely, but it is coincident with the rise of the Internet. And so, although I think that there are certainly contributory factors off the Internet that one can look at, you got to wonder whether, if one believes, as I do, that the Internet is affecting so much of our culture, then you got to wonder, is the Internet in fact having this effect of polarizing us, as the echo chamber argument predicts?
Well, that's interesting. Could be. What would you possibly? My first thought is could be. When people talk about this, I inevitably think of Thomas Jefferson running for president and the incredible negative campaign that was run against him, which I think is part of the polarizing argument. This sort of appealing to people's worst instincts and negative campaigning, and so again, I don't think there's anything new under the sun. You can legitimately argue, though, it's gotten worse because of technology. But let's say it's true. Let's say it has gotten worse. I'm agnostic. I'm skeptical a little bit even. But let's say it has gotten worse. What would you do about it? It's an interesting point. May be true. There's no doubt that to read left or right, the comment sections of prominent blogs is depressing. I think on either side, I think it's extraordinarily depressing what people write. But then I think, well, they're just having fun. Maybe it's just like a place to scream and shout, and maybe I shouldn't put too much stock in it. But let's say I should get worried about it. Let's say it's alarming. Let's say it reduces our ability to solve our problems, make progress, improve the human enterprise. What would you do about it?
Well, another possibility is that we are simply hearing the level of vituperation that otherwise, formerly we couldn't hear because it didn't make it on the broadcast news.
Yeah, it's true.
So what do you do about it? Well, first of all, I wring my hands, so that's one important step forward.
Yeah, it's huge.
Some of this is, I will overstate this, but some of this is determined by the technology, by which I mean we know empirically that small changes in how discussion fora work, small changes in the technology or the policies can have huge effects on the tone of.
Absolutely.
So there is some level of engineering that we can do. If you have a site that is generating just these horrible, awful, pointless, then your forum is broken. You need to fix it, unless that's what you want. But generally, we don't. So we know that there are things you can do. What are those things? I don't know. There's a lot of tinkering that's required because they're very sensitive to very small changes. I could tell you a story, but I will spare you.
No, but anonymity makes a difference versus identifying yourself. There's lots of, which is seemingly small, but it's huge.
Yes. Also, how threading works, and there's tons of variables to play with. Yep. So that's one thing we can do. We can fix broken social media. There are sort of explicit things that people can do in order not to tolerate that level of discourse. And those are good things to say, especially for people who are in positions where they're respected. And there's a set of stuff that can only be done through education, in all the different ways that we have it, including in public schools. But we do need to learn how to engage in discourse in a new medium. Whenever there's a new medium, we have to figure that out. Now we have a new medium that keeps inventing new media, right? I mean, the Internet is not a medium, but it allows lots of different media to emerge, and so we have to keep reinventing how to do it, and to do it in a where the global norms are now at play.
Yeah, it's an interesting point because I think I watch my kids answer the telephone. When they're younger, they pick it up and they go, "What?" The person on the other end doesn't know how to respond to that, and eventually you socialize them. You teach them how to say, how to respond, how to start a conversation, and that's. That will evolve and emerge on the Internet in different ways over time.
Yeah, and it already has, but it does so locally. So at Huffington Post, the sort of things, and at Reddit, there's a highly evolved, actually, set of norms and expectations, or culture that's there. And so in site after site after site after site, these various norms emerge, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. I don't know that there's, in fact, if I had to guess, I'd say there isn't going to be an overall internet norm because of the differences in what the sites are trying to do, which means we have to get better at sites in helping people understand what the norms, policies, and affordances are for each site.
Let's shift gears. I want to talk about a theme in the book that's we haven't touched on, which is, I would call it narrative. You talk about how narrative argument in a book is different than the way we encounter knowledge typically now on the internet, and the difference between a more open, web-like, connected set of links, which is what the internet gives us, to a book which is fixed and somewhat linear. Not all books are linear, but often are. And talk about what has changed there and what you think will change in how we think about arguments and knowledge.
So I think this actually pulls together a couple of the things we've been talking about, because if the world is, in fact, so fractally complex that any pathway through it, connecting pieces, is at best a brave attempt. And what we really need is lots of nerds arguing with lots of nerds. And if the truth is, in fact, in those disagreements and arguments, not in the resolution of them into a single one, because the world is too complex for that, then if we started with the internet as a medium rather than starting with paper and parchment for knowledge, I don't think that we would have come up with the notion that we have in Western culture over the past few thousand years, that the pinnacle of human knowledge is to write what is essentially a narrative argument that leads the reader from the beginning to the end of the argument, and at the end the reader believes something that she actually didn't believe and maybe would have resisted at the beginning of the argument, but each step of the way you constructed this argument. That model, that long-form argument model, is just so wildly out of whack with the world as exposed on the net as a endlessly chaotic set of messy links. I mean, that's how knowledge appears on the net. Because when your nerds argue with my nerds, they're not just doing it on the telephone. They're putting up sites and they're responding to each other and they're doing it in the social media, and it's the big stinking mess.
And they're linking to other sites that you can then go.
100%, yeah. Absolutely. And that entire messy web, and you don't even know where it begins or ends exactly, that is where the knowledge is, just as knowledge in some sense in the old days we think of as being in books and libraries. So that the sort of narrative that that we've taken as being the highest construction of knowledge by humans, that we put it together in these elegant narratives, which have a beauty, no doubt, don't make sense as the pinnacle of knowledge. They make sense as a tour, sort of an idiosyncratic tour through an interesting set of links, but not as the way that the world is. I think the world is coming to look much more like the web than like a long logical argument, or put differently. We used to think that basically that God, or the Creator, thought in these long arguments, that God could see exactly how all the pieces go together, and it was our job with our feeble capabilities to try to get as much of that straight as we could. And right now it's beginning to look like God thinks in webs, not in long arguments.
Yeah, and that's a very it's a very rich idea, and you reflect in the book on the irony of writing a book about how books are increasingly becoming obsolete. It's interesting how few books are nonlinear, right? You can write a nonlinear book, a book of interesting things that are to be sampled non-linearly. There are books like that, not too many. There aren't books like, here's a bunch of interesting things I've thought about, which is what the web is. That's what my blog is, for example, right? My blog is, here's a bunch of interesting things I think about. Any one post is It might be related to some other post, in which case I might link to it, but I don't attempt to just lead the reader on a path. And that's true of these podcasts, right? They're not. There's no plan, not even by me. It's just what I'm interested in and who I feel like talking to. And the reader, the listener, gains knowledge in a very different way from that experience than here are my insights on the financial crisis, A through G. Read them in order. I've constructed them for you to teach you something.
And let me settle that for you.
Yeah, exactly. And when you're done, you'll know.
You're done. You got it. No need to read anything else.
And you're right. I mean, I think it's a richer – this is the way I think the net, in a way, is really making us smarter. You know, the idea that knowledge used to be in libraries is not true. There was never knowledge until you tried to read those books and processed it through your own life and experience. And you don't get wise or knowledgeable by consuming. You get wise and knowledgeable by chewing and thinking and relating. And that's what the internet lets us do.
So that was always the case. The internet lets you do it in public and leave the trails, the traces of your, well, the chewing thing doesn't work. But of your
it's a metaphor.
Yeah, your lines of thought. Right? And so we now have a constantly increasingly rich set of connections among pieces. And furthermore, so this actually goes back to the question of facts, that there are an infinite number, I'll say an infinite number of facts, an indefinite number, including that I have never petted a plaid dolphin. Yeah. But the facts that we care about are ones that we find interesting. Those are the ones we think of as fact. And so underneath knowledge has been human interest all along. And that's inevitable because that's fundamental to us. So we're a creature that cares about what happens to us and that cares about what happens to our world and to others who share that world. That's really fundamental to being a human being. And this new medium, this linked medium, every link expresses human interest. Often in despicable things, but there you have it. I mean, this is a reflection of what we as humans find interesting, and how. So every link is a pointer away from your site to somebody else's, because you think somebody else will find that other site interesting because it shows the world, or a little bit of the world, and how that world matters to the person you're linking to, which is different than how it matters to you. This is such a better reflection of the nature, from my point of view, of the nature of the world. That the world that we live in, that we experience, is infinitely complex, fractally complex, all the way down to the details. It doesn't resolve into simples, and is focused around, based around, is understood through our interests as human beings. And that's just the way it is.
I don't know if you've read it, but Hayek's Nobel Prize lecture is called The Pretense of Knowledge. And what he says in there is that the complexity of human interactions, called an economy, cannot be boiled down to simple causal relationships, which is another way of saying, I think, partly what you just said. I also think about the fact that when I joke with people about when I tell people you ought to have a blog, and especially older people they're not consumers of blogs, so I start telling them what the virtues of them are and the drawbacks. I say one of the virtues is when you have a blog, the editor really likes your stuff. The disadvantage is he always likes your stuff because you can say some things on the web you're ashamed of or regret later. But it is a platform. It's a little or a big megaphone, depending on how popular your blog is. But the part about it that I think is really, again, mirroring your point, is that it's a place to think out loud. You don't have to, because you're the editor, you don't have to write your final word. It can evolve. You can learn new things. You can change your mind, which you can't. Once that book's published, you can write a book later, disagreeing with your own book, your first book. But there is that fixity of print and paper that the web somewhat erases.
Yeah, I got the date of the start of the Well, an early forum on the internet. I got it wrong. Whoops! I can't fix it. It's printed. So
yeah, but everything else on the web, you just change it, you just fix it. Now, it doesn't solve the problem. People may have read the earlier web post that you got it wrong, and they didn't get to the later one. That's still an imperfection that is can't be avoided.
Yeah. if it's perfection you're looking for, you got incarnated into the wrong universe, buddy.
Yeah. Let's close talking about education a little bit, and not so much what we know, but how we learn. How do you think the Internet's going to change things there?
So I look at the world that software developers have built for themselves, the educational environment, ecology they've built, and wonder whether we're all going to be living in such a thing, which would actually be okay with me. So if you are a software developer and you have a question about how to do something or why your code isn't working, you can Google it, get an answer, go to one of the popular sites, and we'll either find an answer, because there are very few questions that have gone unasked and unanswered to this point, or post it and you'll get a response. You'll get a thread back at sites like Stack Overflow, where the best response, where people will improve each other's answers, and the best response gets flagged, and you have your answer. You probably have the code written for you, and then you'll post your own version of it so other people can benefit from it. So not only is this a open collaborative environment in which people are helping each other, it is an example of what public learning looks like, as opposed to learning being a private act in which the individual soul is bettered and the culture is better because we have better people. Instead, this is a declaration that learning itself ought to be a public activity that improves the public. So every time you learn in this new environment, you get an answer. The environment gets better and richer. Engineers are special in part because they could build the tools that they wanted, and that's one reason why this environment has shown up for developers first. It's an incredibly efficient and creative and collaborative environment for learning one's craft, and I hope that we'll see that lots of different disciplines are going to learn from this.
Yeah, I think it has tremendous potential in certain areas. I think education is going to change radically in the next 5 or 10 years. I'm very excited about what Sebastian Thrun is doing with Udacity and providing online education to people around the world for free in terms of monetary costs, and certifying their expertise in computer science, for example. And I think in those areas, computer science, math, and others, that's going to dominate the way we teach these things now for a bunch of reasons. But for other areas, it might be a little bit harder to bring those tools to bear.
Yes. So the effect of the Internet on knowledge overall is very discipline dependent, for sure.
My guest today has been David Weinberger. David, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Russ, thank you so much for having me.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.